Thanks very much. I can't really hope to follow that introduction in terms of the informality and the comedic, but hopefully anyway, there'll be a few interesting. And the project was divided up into a number of work packages with a kind of conceptual framework around diverse values and transdisciplinarity, and then 3 sort of work packages about making diverse values visible. And this was a particular emphasis on sort of arts-based approaches, thinking about values in ocean literacy and embedding values into marine governance, and then how to translate all that in the context of policy decision-making and national planning. It's very busy. I'm impressed. So what we're doing today really is obviously it's a 4-year project, and we can only talk about a little bit of the project. So we're going to focus really on some sort of broad reflections about the project as a whole, but also then thinking about a little bit more detail about making diverse values visible. Because I think it's probably some of the work that we've done in work package 2 that has perhaps sort of differentiated this project from some of the other projects, and is also what we're taking forward into other funded projects as well. So we worked in 3 different case study areas, Portsmouth, Chepstow and Shetland, and each of those case study areas had a theme associated with it. So coastal redevelopment and protection in Portsmouth, Chepstow, water quality, recreation and well-being, and Shetland, rural growth and transition. So a little bit more about a background of diverse values then. Quite shortly after starting the project, IPBES, the International Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, published their diverse values and valuation of nature. So we realised actually this was a really good opportunity for our project to lean into this documentation and to lead into this kind of international approach about diverse values. And there's a couple of aspects of this in particular I think it's worthwhile sort of noting, and that is their values typology. And so this is in a big sort of international context, thinking about sort of integration of lots of different cultural viewpoints, lots of different knowledges from different perspectives. But they sort of broke sort of values down into sort of worldviews and knowledge systems. So thinking about how across sort of broad worldviews, how values can be embedded in different ways into those broad systems. How that can sort of generate broad values, which are kind of guiding life principles and goals, are sort of the almost like the deeper ideas about values that we hold. Then specific values, the judgment made regarding the importance of nature in particular situations. And then kind of really importantly, that the idea there of value indicators. And I think quite often what can happen is we can get really tied up with this idea of value indicators, and we can think, oh, how do we measure something? Oh, how do we go out and how do we kind of put a number on this? And actually we begin to sort of forget about this broader sort of typology of values and the broader kind of context in which values are framed. In that sense, values can be a principle, they can be a preference, they can be the importance. If we think about the general idea about value, it's how important something is to us. And that can be expressed in different ways, it can be measured in different ways, there can be different approaches to try and understand that. And a value can also be a measure. So this was the broad backdrop that we were starting with on the Diverse Marine Values Project. Diverse values cannot be understood from a single disciplinary perspective. That was, if you like, the guiding idea that we had. Actually, we need transdisciplinary conversations if we're going to get at this broader typology of values. Otherwise, you risk having a blind spot. If all you're doing is quantifying values in one particular way, then you're creating a blind spot where some values are not being represented in conversations or discussions or documents. So we thought that was a really important kind of aspect. And so in that sense then, our approach is the plurality of values requires a plurality of valuation methods. We need to use a whole approach. We need to use economics, we need to use ecology, we need to use natural science, we need to use social science. But we can also, what sometimes gets forgotten is the value of the arts and humanities and what that can bring to these value assessments and understanding values. So valuation methods are value-laden in themselves. Methodological choices are political. And I think this is really important, particularly if we're talking about in an institutional context. and that institutions have frameworks. We all know that. We all know that there's a particular evidence-based framework that we're working within. And so what we try to do in the Diverse Marine Values Project is take institutions and not sort of see that as the guiding goal, but as seeing that as part of the broader assemblage around which values are constructed, and that particular approaches lead into, are made as a result of particular decisions. So this idea of epistemic distance is really important. And I think there is a tendency, or it's very easy as kind of experts in different areas to talk past each other when we're using the same words. And so we use a particular word. It might be resilience, it might be well-being, it could be interdisciplinarity. But in using those words, we actually have slightly different meanings depending upon where we're coming from. And in particular, when you start having conversations with broader communities, you really get into a diverse language can mean many different things. So I think this idea of epistemic distance is important, and that quite often, and I see it even in this program, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary are often used kind of almost, you know, one or the other. It doesn't, you know, there's no particularly rigorous definition. Whereas for us, transdisciplinary meant conversations outside of academia, so across disciplines within academia, but then including broader communities. So I think your point about including society in that was really important, because transdisciplinary conversations include that. So I think interdisciplinarity within the natural sciences is widespread: biology, chemistry, soil science, geophysics. These are all forms of interdisciplinarity. But as the epistemic distance between disciplines get greater, I think the challenge for disciplinary integration increases. And in particular, I would say if you've got, this is a very value-laden term, hard science, which Emma likes so much. Emma really doesn't like the term hard science. And, but let's say, for argument's sake, you take the hard science compared to an arts-based approach. You know, different philosophical underpinnings of those kind of concepts makes that integration. Sorry, Erica, did you want to say something on that?
I don't know if I need to put the mic or not, but yeah, you know, something else to really think about is that there's the actual epistemic distance, and then there's our perception of epistemic distance, right? A lot of the stuff that we're talking about in this project is really knowledge that's held in your body. Probably the most easy example, the super facile one, is riding a bike, right? The sort of where you store that knowledge physically. And when we're going to talk about a little bit about how we've used drama as a tool to really understand and study ocean literacy, it's really trying to find where that knowledge is stored in the bodies of the people that we're working with.
Thank you very much. And I think as you start to make this transition into these different disciplines, these almost different philosophies underpinning different forms of knowledge, it starts to really open up new territories for inquiry and new ways of thinking about different types of engagement. So we've chosen to talk a little bit more about arts-based approaches in this kind of reporting. You know, that other things went on in the project. One of the points I want to make out, although we're talking about arts-based approach, we're not talking about one thing. There can be diverse arts practices. We can think of the visual arts, we can think of theatre, we can think of soundscapes, music. So the arts refer to a diversity of practices, but equally as a diversity of artists as well. Just because you might have the label of an artist does not mean you can be kind of lumped into some homogenous grouping and everyone thinks the same. So I think this is actually really important, because I do think there is a disconnect. I think there's a wide body of artists and an art world that exists out there where there's lots of artists doing lots of different works, really interesting, but they don't make a connection with groups like this. And they don't make a connection with environmental management and natural resources. And I think that there is an interesting disconnect about that sort of cultural, artistic world and making that connection. And some artists are great at it, others are not so, others they're not interested in it. So I think that we have to be careful in thinking about what we mean by artists. And there are diverse different types of artists and arts practitioners. It comes down to there being people behind the disciplines and the importance of process and product, which we'll talk about a bit more. So just by way of just a couple more points, by way of trying to sort of demystify some of the kind of concepts. Again, we talk about decision making. And I often feel that we talk about that almost in a term of a black box. You know, as if decision making is one thing. Say, oh yeah, decision makers and policy makers and you know, and But actually, if we begin to critically break that down, what do we mean by that? You know, what decisions? Who's making the decisions? Are we talking about a kind of technical management decision that's being driven by legislation? Or are we talking about a broader kind of wicked problem like sort of climate change? There's multiple stakeholders and multiple forms of governance associated with that. And then within that, then we've got the sort of the idea of a policy cycle, not an ideal concept, but potentially valuation, sort of, you know, in the agenda setting stage, the policy formula stage, the policy adoption stage. There can be different entry routes into decision making. So I think one of the kind of, you know, reflections of the project is to try and have a more nuanced understanding about these terms that we commonly use, and think about how arts and other approaches can be framed in the context of that. And then sort of similarly, and these diagrams, sorry, these are all from the IPBES documents. We're leaning on the IPBES document for some of this stuff. The idea perhaps there can be, you know, shallower and deeper approaches. You know, we can recognize the value of nature. We can go out and do a valuation. You know, we can do economic valuations. We can do different types of measurements. We can do ecological assessments, etc. But then what gets done with those? How does they actually get translated into some sort of actionable change? As we kind of, so how do we embed those in decision making? How might those valuations reform policies? How might that create shift in societal norms and goals? So I think if we're talking about transformational change, then there are a whole different range of different leverage points we need to think about hitting in order to enable that transformational change. And that, of course, leads us quite nicely into the next project that we're working on as part of the Resilience Coastal Communities, called TRACK, which is about transformational change. So I'll get that in there as a plug. So 13 minutes. Am I all right? Oh, okay, we started early. All right. I'm normally horrendous for going over time, so I'm trying to be as disciplined as possible. But this slide, I think, is really important. So this is kind of one of the, sort of key reflection slides, I suppose, to say, it's all very well to say, okay, diversity of arts, but that, you know, it's helpful, but not that helpful. But I think, so what we're trying to break it down, partly through our experience in the project, partly through broader kind of literature work, etc., as well. And we kind of identify 5 dimensions of art-based approaches in relation to decision and policy making. And obviously the first one, science communication through art. We all know that. We all know if we get artists, graphic designers on board in our projects, we can get much clearer visuals, much better visuals. You know, go and talk to the professionals, and it makes a huge difference. I'm sure we've all designed our own kind of posters, and you know, and they're good, they're good, but then you get a professional graphic designer on board, and you know, it's a difference between night and day. So science is communication through art. You've then got activism through art as well, and this is kind of, we're using as an example of a way that perhaps you can influence policy and decision making from the outside, not from sort of going through the sort of different organizations, but thinking about the way that communities will mobilize art in their own way. And the example that we came across in the project was on the River Wye, and local groups creating the goddess, recreating the goddess of the Wye, and that being taken to Cardiff Court, you know, used outside the court, used in sort of legal bats, and became a really sort of focus for trying to think about the pollution, the problems in the Wye catchment. So I think activism through art. Perhaps an area that is really, really exciting is socially engaged art, facilitating stakeholder discourse and understanding. And this is where artists are involved in choreographing a process as opposed to thinking about a final product. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about some of the theatre work that we've been doing. And I think then these art approaches, they can build, it's not just about communication, they can build empathy and new relations. You know, art, by engaging with arts in different ways, you can build empathy and approaches. You can tap into that idea of relationality, how different things are connected in the environment, how people and place come together, and how that can be expressed. And arguably, new knowledge can be generated through art. And that, of course, is a fundamental ontological and epistemological challenge of how knowledge is created, what is the basis for knowledge, how do we understand truth, how do we understand facts, etc. So I think, and that's where, of course, you start to get into some difficult conversations and about it. So I think that's quite important, that kind of dimensionality. So in the project then, we had kind of 4 arts-based approaches. which we're going to tell you a little bit more about. We had a photo essay, which I did. There are QR codes here if you want to see it. Likewise, there's a table downstairs where we've got exhibition handouts, and we've got the QR codes as well down there. So if you want to know more about sort of the photo essay, what the role of that, then we can tell you, we can answer questions about that, I think. But I think at this point, I'd like to hand over to Emma to start to tell you a little bit about the others.
Thank you. It wouldn't be like the diverse values team to do something simply, so lots of moving around. So as Tim said, we used art-based methods in the project, and we just thought today was a real opportunity to showcase some of those processes and the outputs from those processes. So you're going to, that didn't sound good. You're going to see some really short examples of the digital story process that we undertook that was led by Elena Bocelli from the University of Greenwich, and also the community voice method films, which we have full copies of downstairs. You can see the whole films for each of our 3 communities, so Portsmouth, the Y catchment, and Shetland. And one of the things that we're really trying to challenge is those diversities of relationships, but also particularly with CHEPSO, the idea of who gets to be coastal, who gets to be considered to be part of the communities whose values are important when we're talking about marine and coastal issues. And then we're going to get you moving and doing something a bit more exciting. You know, we like to do that in rooms that are quite small. So then Erica will talk us through some socially engaged theatre work as well. So hopefully this is going to work. We're going to go first to an example of one of our digital stories, which has come from one of our community members in Portsmouth.
Hello, I'm Puriya. I'm happy living here because I love it. Fortunately, my heart is out, which became the coast. When the weather is good, I usually go to the beach for a walk, sit down, and watch the beautiful sea. I also enjoy listening to the sound of the waves. This activity helps me relax in a new way. Given that I am an introvert, being on the beach genuinely makes me happy. I prefer to be alone in that healing environment. Unfortunately, in my city in Iran, there was no sea. Therefore, it's very beneficial for me to be here.
There you go. So digital stories are a process of giving individuals the power to create their own visual stories with their own voices. So you purposely don't see their faces, but you hear their story, you see the images that they have selected to tell their stories. The next example that we're showing is an excerpt from our watershed film, which was the community voice method film created for the Y catchment. And we thought we'd show this because we feel like Shetland film has been shown quite a few times, and we thought we'd show somewhere a little bit different. So this is Angela Jones, who you may have spotted in Tim's slides. And she's an activist who is a wild swimmer and feels very passionately about the Y and swims in the Y every day. And thinks about that connection for her kind of individual relationships with the place she has grown up in and the water around her. I will stop stealing her thunder and click through.
When I'm completely underwater and going along in the salmon to spawn, I notice salmon form the way they rest. When I go in there, I can smell, I can taste them before I get close to them. Or if I see an eel, and you know that eel is a good 30, 40 years old, gosh, you know where it's coming from, how far it's taken to get here. We see the seasons change so dramatically. The leaves coming out, we smell the wild garlic, we see the daffodils, we see the swallows and the swifts in the summer. And compared to other places where we go, it's really special. It's something really, really lovely about it. We're very lucky.
I used to get up in the morning at 4:30. I used to get one on the back, or I would just drift up to the top. Picture that, and the herons would come up and investigate it, and the kingfish would come and investigate it, and it's total silence. And you've gone back 1,000 years when you get there in the final day, and it's the owl. Oh man, I like it. I've got goosebumps just now. Honestly, I've got goosebumps just thinking about it. It's a stunning sight.
This place is a very special environment.
it has a mystical feel. It also is a working planning. That's very important. So there are families who are far too generation. There are people who are wedded to the land here, and that gives a sense of identity.
This area was extremely isolated. It's hard to imagine now, but it was actually quite an isolated place until the bridge was built. That sort of deep sense of uniqueness developed in that area between the Sevres and Wye.
So community voice method is a process of recorded interviews, of filmed interviews, where you then develop into a documentary film, which is then shown back to communities through a workshop, deliberative conversation process to discuss different topics. So our 3 films were shown back to our communities, inviting the interviewees who were part of our films, so our stars. And then we talked through the topics that were raised through the films and talked about whose values were perhaps missing, whose values they really resonated with the communities that were in the room with us, and what they thought they needed to do next. I guess one of the caveats that we should say with community voice method is that it's not there to provide solutions, it's there to stimulate conversation. It's a catalyst for further conversation and thinking about how different values need to be reflected within decisions that are taken around marine and coast. And with the Chepstow site, again, I think it's probably important to raise it. It's not particularly marine as a film, but what we were trying to do was show that there is that whole system connection that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about the issues facing our coastal spaces. So now I'm going to hand over to Erica.
So when we talk about theater as a kind of a research tool, so this is a really silly question. Raise your hand if you've seen a play. Great, amazing. And raise your hand if you've been in a play. Okay, cool. Raise your hand if you've, if that play that you were in, you were a young person. Okay, great. So when we think about theater, and we say theater, oftentimes the sort of first meeting that we have is people kind of panic or freeze a little bit, and then they imagine kind of jazz hands, right? And a sort of a product focus, right? A play, right? That you make or that you do. But this kind of work is inherently process-based. Which means that the rehearsal process is the most important part. And then there's other kinds of theater work that we're doing where the performance itself is also something of a rehearsal. So it's not about creating a kind of a perfectly rehearsed, you know exactly what you're going to say thing that you show to an audience, but rather turning the mirror or the lens on yourself as participants who become co-performers to co-create an artistic experience. And through that process of co-creation, you then learn a little bit, something deeper about your relationship to whatever the subject is. You can then, of course, take that data and you can treat it in a very traditional qualitative manner, which is what we did. But this work really comes out of an activist space originally. So Augusto Boal was a Brazilian theater maker who worked with communities and originally was taking these kind of activist plays out into these kind of small communities. And then he realized actually that what he was doing was kind of alive because he was giving something or showing something to the communities as opposed to doing something with the community. So it's inherently about co-creation, and it's really, really influenced as well by the work of Paulo Freire, if you know his pedagogy of the oppressed. So the performance work that we did, that we're going to talk about today, comes from Shetland and Portsmouth. And the Shetland performance was with young people. So we worked with a group of 10 youths from the ages of 13 to 17. And this was in collaboration with Shetland Arts. And then at the University of Portsmouth, we worked with 2 different cohorts of students in the Marine and Coastal Management Master's Program. And
so, as Erica said, one of the things that we looked at from a qualitative perspective, and Tim had mentioned that we talked about ocean literacy as one of the kind of underpinning frameworks for the project. So just recently we've had a paper published where we looked at the role of theatre in enhancing and fostering different aspects of ocean literacy, and we thought it was just worth sticking this on a slide for you so you could see the kind of thinking that we had. And we were particularly looking at different types of knowledges, as Eric has already mentioned. I'm not going to press that button because I'm scared of it. And so the one at the top. So thinking about how theatre could bring about different kinds of knowledge, particularly with the master students, and how it would give them diverse knowledges and skills of understanding what a consultation experience might be like, or how they could develop skills around stakeholder engagement through theatre practice. With the work that we did with the young people in Shetland, it was really about trying to get to their knowledge about what it was like being a young person living in a Shetland community as a teenager in that space. But we were particularly interested in these 4 dimensions of ocean literacy around emotions, so emotional connection, be that positive, negative, or neutral. I think that's something that's really important as a marine community, that we recognize that not everybody's going to have a positive relationship with the ocean, and we need to be okay with that. We need to kind of meet people where they are. Thinking about theatre and storytelling as a way of accessing and experiencing ocean spaces, and it not always having to be a physical experience. And then we kind of looked at adaptive capacity and trust issues related to that as well. There's lots more we could say about that, but I'm going to go back to the questions now.
Yeah, so what we'd like to do now is actually invite you to participate in 2 kind of very, sample taster activities that we did in Shetland and in Portsmouth with our participants, so that you can kind of feel what it feels like. And again, these were, processes that kind of took a week. We're kind of condensing this into about 5 minutes, but just so you can kind of get a sense of what we're doing. So the first thing I would like to ask you to do is, if everybody can, take a big deep breath in, and take a big deep breath out, and take another deep breath in. And as you take a big deep breath out, make a noise. Go, ah, just make a noise. Anyways, that's nice. That's really great. That's great. That's great. Good, good. And if everybody feels a little bit silly, then nobody's, kind of we're all in this together. Now I'd like to ask you to take another deep breath in, and then make the biggest gesture you can. If you can stand, stand, and if not, just make the biggest gesture from your seat. So take a deep breath in, and then biggest gesture that you can. Go. Amazing. Excellent. Nice, nice, nice. Very nice. And you can kind of bring it back down. Great. Now, we're going to do an activity called Come Be My Neighbor. So what I'd like you to do now is, if you identify with the following statement, this is a kind of a self-claiming, identifying autoethnographic exercise that we're going to be doing collectively. So if you identify with the following statement, please stand up. So please come be my neighbor if you really like cats. Amazing. Come be my neighbor if you identify or see yourself as a qualitative researcher. Oh. Oh, interesting. Oh, wow. Amazing. All right. That was really great. First of all, yeah, give yourself a round of applause. You participated very successfully in that. But so unpacking that activity, what that activity did was it actually gives us a lot of information about who's in the room. But so those kinds of conversations, what we hope are an opening point or a starting point to really kind of a deepening the relationship of co-creation with your participants in a situation. They also invite a particular relatively easy access point when it comes to autoethnography and ethnography. So thinking about inviting participants to think narratively around their experience, and then some different ways of capturing that. As Emma and I were saying, the paper that we published actually used very traditional qualitative data. We gathered responses and then we coded them. And so these so these kinds of tools are working in tandem with the traditional methods that we all already know. It's not necessarily a replacement. It's an addition. It's a value added in many ways. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just going to hold this because it's easier. Okay, so we're very conscious of time, so I'm going to skip very, very rapidly through this and build this so it doesn't take me too long. So as Tim said at the beginning, we've been using a lot of social science and arts-based methodologies and thinking about how we can feed them into policy making and decision-making processes, which, as you can imagine, is a bit challenging. And so some work that was led by Catherine Fredera, who's now at the University of Glasgow, but also Howell Marine Consulting, and Mario's here as well, really started to explore how the diverse methods that we were using in the project could be fed into developing institutional capacity for making better policies, for decision making. And these are some of the recommendations. I'm just going to pick a couple of them. So the top one was from Catherine's work, which is around needing to understand and improve access for communities to law and decision-making processes, and actually enhancing process literacy. So if people don't understand the process of decision-making, the process of governance, how can they have a meaningful role in that process? How can their values be meaningfully integrated? So that was one of the bits that came out of our fourth work package about understanding decision-making processes. From an institutional capacity perspective, which was work that was led by Lucy Greenhill at HMC, these are the kind of recommendations that have come out around developing a typology of marine decision making to inform developing a framework to think about where diverse values might have entry points within those decision making processes, and where there might be needs to build capacity around pathways to impact or opportunities for integrating different values and different methods into decision-making processes. Recognizing that some of that might need to be associated with supporting institutions and thinking about the ways in which they work, and the fact that actually their systems are perhaps not designed to integrate this sort of data, this sort of information, and these sorts of values into the decision-making processes that they currently have. And then this final one I'm going to just highlight was around the thinking about how social values are currently represented in decision making, and how they can be integrated more effectively into marine planning, designation of MPAs, all sorts of other marine related issues. So very, very quickly in closing, we just wanted to highlight a few key methods associated with the qualitative arts-based methods that we've been using. They take time, they take resources, but they are an incredibly valuable, meaningful way of facilitating really in-depth conversations that are very place-based and community-led. We really want to highlight the fact that arts-based methods do not have to focus on a product, that it is about the process of that co-development and co-design. And that, as Erica said, we're not talking about these being necessarily in isolation, that they can work with social science and natural science disciplines to think about kind of the whole picture and that diversity of values. Crucially, we really, really want to highlight this, that arts-based methods are not just about communication and about communicating our science as a marine science community, and that really transdisciplinary thinking is really strengthened by and through the inclusion of arts and creative methods. So really kind of like to see that happening more and more across the marine research community. And we have a podcast series and a transdisciplinary guide really highlighting and talking through all of our methods, which we launch really soon, and we'll make sure to make that available out to you when it is. So that's it. I know we have not very much time for questions. Sorry, Dave. But we're informal. So yes, thank you so much. Yeah, for everybody.